Continue speaking and reflecting on Aziz Pahad. Political analyst Professor Dirk Kotze from UNISA also joins us now for a look back at the life of the late Aziz Pahad. Prof. Kotze, always a pleasure to see you, sir. Talk about, the sort of legacy that Aziz Pahad leaves behind politically, that is, and sort of how, as South Africans, we should remember this a stalwart.
Well, he had always a very close relationship with President Mbeki.
Yeah.
And President Mbeki's development of his African agenda, the African Renaissance, the formation of the African Union, the peer review mechanisms, all of them, Aziz Pahad was very much part of that. And I know for a fact that there had many discussions informally also about this. We should also remember that they go back to the time when they were students together.
Yeah.
In the UK. So they have actually a lifelong friendship. And I think the two together is how we should look at them. Deputy Minister Pahad was very much the behind-the-scenes person of President Mbeki, but he was the one who very often implemented a lot of what were the ideas of President Mbeki. He and the minister, especially Dlamini Zuma, were also a very strong partnership. They formed a very strong partnership, and I think this is what will be remembered of him ultimately. Is that period when they worked in combination, she as minister and he as the deputy minister.
Yeah.
Later on, he became very much involved in specific missions, peace type of missions. I myself was part of a group that went to the South Sudan just after the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, and he was leading that delegation for more than a week long, where we met the leadership of the SPLM. That was typical, the type of work that the Deputy Minister Pahad was doing throughout his time as the Deputy Minister.
Yeah, and having been part of this particular delegation that you speak of, when you speak of the specific missions that he had been involved in, what was your perception of him during that particular time? And it seems, you speak quite highly of him, but having, worked sort of closely with him, having been part of this delegation, what are your sort of initial thoughts going into that?
Well, he was a person who was, first of all, very well informed about the dynamics of a particular situation. He understood it very well. He had the background knowledge. He was informed about what the issues were, who are the persons involved in it. And therefore, he could establish a very strong link almost immediately with the persons involved. This particular mission was the current president of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, was his counterpart in that situation. The same one can say also with his efforts in order to prevent the war in Iraq, where President Mbeki sent him to Iraq to meet Saddam Hussein and try to resolve the situation before it developed into the war. I think it's not so well known anymore, but that was, I think, one of his most difficult missions, where he had to try to negotiate amongst the big powers, like the US, that became quite directly involved in it. And I think as a result of that, also his partnership with someone like Ambassador Balile Nhlapo, who became our first ambassador at the OAU, and later became involved very closely with the African Union, and later he was our ambassador also in Washington. They formed a partnership behind the scenes, very often informally, that was driving the foreign policy of South Africa at the ministerial level and at the level of officials, which is, I think, only much later it will become known to what extent that was influential in what happened in the early 2000s, when South Africa was very much a prominent player in the international community.
You know, Prof, it seems as though you had anticipated my next question. In fact, I wanted to go there. Those talks, in reference to the USA, and Iraq. I mean, these are two, one can say, enemies. You know, how was he able to navigate that and having to, of course, have those sort of negotiations with Saddam Hussein? I mean, as Deputy Foreign Minister at the time, and I heard it in one of the clips that we played here that, he essentially played, quite a big role in helping to stop that war at that time between the USA and Iraq. And I mean, how would he have managed to do that? He was quite vocal on the issues between the two countries. We certainly have a lot of sound clips of him speaking on the US and Iraq. But what a mammoth task that might have been. And I mean, you mentioned it. You say, it was one of the most difficult missions. But, how did he navigate that?
Well, I think first of all, because he spoke on behalf of South Africa and on behalf of President Mbeki, the fact that the South African government was then seen as sort of, in a sense, I won't say even-handed, but being access to both sides, that of Iraq on the one hand and the US on the other hand, and that they could sort of present South Africa as maybe not one of the main players in that particular situation, but because it was still so close to the time of the changes in South Africa, the association with President Mandela, and Aziz Pahad was obviously his Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs during his time, that he had that reputation as someone who can understand the different sides. I mean, we have to be honest that ultimately it didn't work because the war continued, and ultimately Saddam Hussein was deposed from his position. But it put South Africa then at a very central position of trying to not mediate, but trying to facilitate some form of coming together to try to avoid the war. The situation obviously in the end became just too big for him. So he went for South Africa in general as a medium-sized player in the international community. And therefore he couldn't sort of resolve it to a large extent. The US have made up their mind much longer already. And that was, I think, unfortunately for him, the end of it. So, but that is, I think, will ultimately stand out as one of the key mammoth tasks that they had to undertake in order to intervene on behalf of South Africa, but also the African community in general.
All right, Prof, always great hearing your informed analysis. Professor Dirk Kotze, political analyst representing UNISA, of course. We're going to take a short break. More news coming up after this. Stay with us here on SABC News.